So there seems to be a lot of movement on the Final Fantasy IX front as they are getting ready to celebrate the 25-year anniversary of the game's initial release, and there's a bunch of new merchandise that's been coming out, and it's got people wondering, what about that Final Fantasy IX remake? What's going on with that? Could this all be connected? So we're going to take a look at that in today's video. If any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe and let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Alright, so we are in the last week of March, and as I'm recording this video, a bunch of new merchandise to celebrate the 25-year anniversary of Final Fantasy IX just got released. And I mean like a lot of new merchandise. Statues / action figures, plushies, a VV storybook, a vinyl record, I believe there's even going to be a board game, there's jewelry, tons of stuff to celebrate FF9. Now, keep in mind, this is a 25-year anniversary celebration. 25 years usually gets celebrated a little differently compared to something like a 22-year or a 26-year or a 27-year. Those 5-year increments are massive. So that could explain why all of this is happening. Let's just do something really cool and really big for a very beloved game. But the timing of all of this has got people questioning if that Final Fantasy IX remake is real and if it's going to be announced soon, because as of right now, we are a few days away from that Nintendo Switch 2 Direct, which is going to be hitting very early in the morning, unfortunately. And some people are wondering, hey, maybe this stuff could be connected to that remake as well, and maybe it could show up at that Switch 2 Direct. Assuming they show off third-party games at this Direct, for all we know, it could be first-party only, and then maybe at a later date, they do a third-party Direct to showcase those games. So we don't really quite know for sure, but again, as always, we take all of this information with a massive grain of salt. And one of the things causing people to say that is the statues that we've seen of Zidane and Dagger. Now, for the most part, they look pretty close to their original character designs, but they do look a little bit different, specifically in their faces. The art style and design of their faces are very different compared to how they looked in the original game. It's their eyes that look a little different. It's a little bit more cartoony, maybe a little bit more anime, which has people questioning, was this connected to the Final Fantasy IX anime that was rumored? But if I remember correctly, I believe the studio that was working on that did get shut down, so I don't think that's happening anymore. But there is some validity to that Final Fantasy IX remake. Again, if we look at that NVIDIA GeForce Now leak that happened like 65 million years ago at this point, almost every game that was on that list has come out, except for Final Fantasy IX Remake and Final Fantasy Tactics Remake. Those have been curiously absent. They've not been hinted at or mentioned by anyone at Square Enix or even Sony. And the last few times we heard about Final Fantasy IX Remake came from Jeff Grubb, who is an industry insider, who said, yeah, I've seen Final Fantasy IX Remake. It's real. It's not quite on the level of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but it's not quite a simple remaster like Crisis Core Reunion was. It's somewhere in the middle, which kind of makes me wonder if this is a test by Square Enix to do a higher quality AA remake / remaster kind of thing instead of doing a full-on big expensive AAA project. I believe it also may have been Jeff Grubb as well who said that it looked like it had Sony written all over it, meaning it was going to be a Sony PlayStation exclusive. However, we do know that Square Enix is really changing their mindset these days when it comes to the platforms they release their games on, and they're moving away, thankfully, from platform exclusivity and doing multi-platform as a big focus for the company. So, if that's the case, Final Fantasy IX Remake could release on almost every console available, which would be really good for the game. There were also some other rumors from random, less reliable people who just popped up on places like Reset Era who said, yes, I too have seen this remake, and it's going to have the same turn-based combat that the original game has. But, you know, take all of this with a grain of salt. They're just rumors as of right now, and normally I don't cover rumors, but there seems to be a little bit of smoke in this situation, and when there's smoke, there usually ends up being fire. Now, you're probably wondering, do you have any evidence to back this up? Kind of. So if we look at known leaker Nate the Hate, who has been popping up a lot recently when it comes to leaking games or showcases from people like Sony and Nintendo, they've been pretty spot on with a lot of what they've been calling. And earlier this year, Nate the Hate said that Final Fantasy VII Remake as well as Rebirth would eventually head to the Switch 2, with Remake landing this year and Rebirth heading there next year. So there's a possibility that Final Fantasy VII Remake will also show show up at this Nintendo Switch 2 Direct, which I'm hoping it does. That would be pretty sick. And you're probably wondering, well, that's just a rumor. Yes, it is, but to kind of corroborate that rumor, we go to an article from Nintendo Life, which reported that a French gaming outlet did receive some Switch 2 stock in their inventory to mark down and get their SKUs ready for the inevitable launch of that console. And on those SKUs were accessories as well as software. Now, the games themselves were not listed, just the publisher. So people like Bandai Namco were there, Warner Brothers, Take-Two, Electronic Arts, Bethesda, and Square Enix. And the number of games they had planned were listed as well. And for Square Enix, they allegedly have 5 games headed to the Switch 2. Now, if we look at what Nate says, 2 of those games would be 7 Remake and 7 Rebirth, which leaves 3 other slots open. What could those other games be? Maybe Final Fantasy XIV gets ported there. Maybe they decide to do Final Fantasy XVI. Or Final Fantasy IX Remake could potentially be heading to the Switch. Now, Nate was also asked specifically about the other Final Fantasy remakes, specifically 9 and Tactics. And according to Nate, Final Fantasy IX will not launch this year, however, it could see launch next year, which would make sense. And what better way for Square Enix to commemorate the celebration of Final Fantasy IX, that 25 years, by announcing, hey, we are doing a remake. You would announce it this year and potentially release it next year. Now, one of the bigger pieces of evidence comes from a video we covered many years ago from YouTuber Paolo from Tokyo, who has a series called A Day in the Life of, where he shadows a random person at their job in Japan. And in one of those videos, he shadowed a young woman who happened to work at Square Enix. And at one point in the video, when that woman got busy, Paolo decided to explore the Square Enix offices, and he ran into a man who I'm pretty sure was Toshiyuki Itahana. And Itahana was one of the character designers on Final Fantasy IX. So Paolo interviews him and he says he's working on a project and some artwork, but he can't say what it is. It's top secret. But on his desk is just so much memorabilia from Final Fantasy IX, including a massive statue of Zidane and Kuja, which is gorgeous. So it's reaching, but it's possible that Itahana was working on that Final Fantasy IX remake and updating those character designs, maybe working on locations, who knows? But I feel like that's one of the bigger pieces of evidence, because from my understanding, that project that he was working on, as far as I know, hasn't been announced yet. So I feel like that's one of the more credible pieces of evidence. So while this is all just rumor for now, we are going to have to wait until that Nintendo Switch 2 Direct happens and see if Final Fantasy IX shows up there. If it doesn't, it's possible that maybe Sony still has some sort of weird exclusivity attached to the Final Fantasy games, and maybe it gets announced at a Sony event, but it does end up being multi-platform. That is honestly kind of like my biggest hope. I really do hope that if this game is real, it releases on every platform possible so it has the most success possible. And Final Fantasy IX is still a game that is very well loved and is still selling very well. According to Automaton via Audrey on Twitter, Final Fantasy IX in total since its release in 2000 has sold 8.9 million copies, and from 2019 until now, it has sold 3 million copies. So that's pretty big in that time frame for a game that old to sell 3 million units on both console and digital. That shows that there is still a pretty big demand for Final Fantasy IX, and 9 is like one of the most beloved Final Fantasies out there. It's got potentially, in my opinion, one of the best, not just Final Fantasy characters, but characters in a video game period in Vivi. He's such an incredibly well-written character that teaches you so much about identity and life and loss, and his arc is just so beautiful, also a little bittersweet. And to get the chance to revisit that and that character would be so cool. And if this remake does end up being a thing, how could it, flesh out? I think this is a scenario where they would keep it pretty faithful to the original game. I don't see it being a 7 remake situation where it's this big AAA multi-part game that's got some new stuff added. I think they would keep the same story, same combat, but obviously upgrade the visuals, make some quality of life adjustments to combat, equipment, abilities, update the music. But also potentially one of the biggest new additions could be voice acting. Now, characters like Zidane and Kuja have had voice actors in the past in the Dissidia games, but I don't know if they would stick with those actors in particular, or if they would want to just start fresh and have a brand new cast for some of these characters. Because I don't recall if we've ever heard Garnet's voice, we've never heard Steiner. I do remember Vivi was in Kingdom Hearts 2, but I don't recall what his voice sounded like if he did speak. It's been so long, but if I remember correctly, he was in the world where Roxas was from. I believe he was working with Cypher and a bunch of other kids, so it's been a while since I played Kingdom Hearts 2, but I do recall Vivi being in that game. But it also creates a really interesting situation for the Final Fantasy franchise that kind of takes Square Enix down the Capcom route. And we've been talking about this for years at this point, but many moons ago, Capcom was in the crapper. They were going under, and there were some pretty big rumors saying that they would be bought out by an even bigger company. And I believe that company was rumored to be Tencent. And Capcom was just not doing well. They were trying to create games for specific regions of the world instead of just making games for a global audience. So franchises like Resident Evil and Devil May Cry suddenly went from being Japanese focused to, okay, we're gonna make these our Western games. And then something like Monster Hunter would be for their Japanese audience. So they really kind of segregated a lot of their games based on regions, and that just was not working out. So eventually they went through a pretty tumultuous time. They did a ton of restructuring, and now they are flourishing. And you see so many other Japanese companies, including Square Enix, go through what Capcom was going through, and they're now looking at Capcom as the blueprint of what to do to become successful again. And part of that strategy was just focusing on making really good games that appeal to everyone. And now they're super successful. They've got the remakes of Resident Evil. They've got Street Fighter and Monster Hunter that are doing really well, but they're also pulling from their back catalog and bringing back older games like Onimusha and doing remasters. And on some occasions, releasing new IP. And I think that's a really good blueprint for Square Enix to follow. And it kind of seems like maybe they're doing that. They've got their mainline Final Fantasies, but then they've also got the remakes. And the remakes are kind of interesting because Final Fantasy VII is just a very special project. That has to be 3 full games. It's a really big, full budget AAA project. That is, very different. That's a unique scenario. But this could be an opportunity for Square Enix to have other Final Fantasy remakes that are maybe not quite super AAA, maybe just below it in that AA kind of area, that are relatively well put together, have a healthy budget, but can still bring back older Final Fantasy games and non-Final Fantasy games at that, and have them be these kind of remake remasters kind of situations. And again, we're going to have to see if Final Fantasy IX does end up being real and what kind of game it ends up being in terms of budget and overall quality. But if it comes out and it's like a high quality AA game, that I think sets a really good precedent moving forward for Final Fantasy and remakes, because now you can do that with every Final Fantasy if you really wanted to, because not everything has to be on the scale of a 7 remake, and I don't think it's feasibly possible for everything to be on the scale of a Final Fantasy 7 remake. It's just such a massive project. It's taken so long, and if you would try to do that with things like Final Fantasy 6 or 8 or 9, those would potentially be even bigger. So I like the idea of these just below AAA Final Fantasy remake remasters that come out, are pretty true to the original, but are updated in all the right ways. I think it could lead Square Enix to do that with a lot of their older franchises, which is pretty exciting. Now again, these are all just rumors, it's all just speculation, but I wanted to talk about it because it's a really cool opportunity to talk about Final Fantasy IX, and also just to celebrate that 25-year anniversary again. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago when that game came out. I still remember playing that game. My grandpa came over one day and he was watching me play for a few minutes, and that was just like a really cool memory I had of Final Fantasy IX. But it's such a beloved game. So many people talk about it still to this day, and I think a lot of people are craving some sort of remake, remaster of this game. So with that being said, that's the video. I am Curious Corduroy. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you guys think is happening with Final Fantasy IX? Do you think the remake is real? Do you think it could get announced at that Switch 2 Direct? Or do you think this is all just to celebrate the 25-year milestone for Final Fantasy IX? I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.